In the heart of a great American city, autumn arrived the way it always did, quietly, almost apologetically, turning the leaves the color of old fire and pressing a thin chill into the morning air. On one such morning, a man who had lived for years without being noticed by anyone bent down to pick up a scarf that did not belong to him, and in doing so, he made a woman smile for the first time in longer than she could remember. Neither of them understood, in that small and ordinary moment, that a door neither could see had just opened between two lives that had been broken in almost identical ways. Behind that woman's rare smile lived a heart shattered by betrayal and loss, sealed shut so tightly that even she had stopped believing it could ever open again. And behind the man's quiet, unassuming kindness lived a secret so enormous, so carefully hidden, that when it finally surfaced, it would not simply surprise her. It would rewrite everything she thought she understood about her own life, her own company, and the very foundation on which her success had been built. Emily Carter was 38 years old, and by every outward measure, she was a woman who had already won. She sat at the top of a technology empire worth billions. In a corner office with glass walls overlooking a skyline she had helped shape with her own decisions, her own sleepless nights, her own relentless refusal to fail. Her name appeared in headlines with the kind of reverence usually reserved for people twice her age, and strangers on the street sometimes recognized her from magazine covers where she stood in tailored suits, arms folded, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the camera. She was beautiful in the precise, deliberate and precise, no matter what storm might be raging underneath the surface. Her employees admired her from a careful distance. They also feared her, just slightly, and among themselves, in hallways and elevators where they thought she could not hear, they called her the Ice Queen. It was not cruelty that earned her the name. It was distance, a wall built brick by brick over years, and warmth simply could not find a way through it anymore. That distance had not always existed. There had been a time, many years earlier, when Emily still believed in things like partnership and trust, when she had planned a wedding with a man she loved and built a company alongside a friend she believed would stand beside her for the rest of her life. Both illusions collapsed within the same terrible year. Her fiancé, it turned out, had been unfaithful for the better part of 2 years, hiding an entire second life behind a smile Emily had once found comforting. Around the same time, the man she considered her closest friend and business partner had been quietly maneuvering behind her back, feeding information to a rival investor group in exchange for a position he believed he deserved more than she did. Emily survived both betrayals through sheer will, rebuilding her company and her reputation from the wreckage. But something in her had closed permanently in the process. She gave herself instead to spreadsheets, to boardrooms, to the endless architecture of growth and control. It was a life without cracks, and also a life almost entirely without light. There had been another woman once, briefly, a colleague who introduced her to Emily's world through a mutual acquaintance at a charity dinner nearly 2 years after the wedding that never happened, and for a short while, Emily wondered whether kindness might still exist somewhere within reach. It did not last. The colleague, it turned out, had been far more interested in the doors Emily's name could open than in Emily herself. And when that became obvious, Emily simply stopped trying altogether. She told herself she had made peace with a life lived mostly alone. Filling the empty hours with quarterly reports and strategy sessions, convincing herself that ambition was a fair trade for whatever softness she had lost along the way. It was, she believed, a reasonable exchange, right up until the moment a stranger on a windy sidewalk suggested otherwise without even knowing her name. Daniel Brooks lived on the opposite end of that same city. In a small apartment above a bakery that smelled of cinnamon every morning before dawn broke properly over the rooftops. He was 40 years old, quiet in the way of men who had already lived through the worst thing life could offer, and had come out the other side without bitterness, only a kind of settled, unhurried peace. Years earlier, he had been a father raising a son entirely on his own, after losing his wife to a long illness, waking before sunrise to make lunches, sitting up late helping with homework, learning to braid hair from instructional videos because there was no one else left to teach him. His son was grown now, independent. building a life of his own in another state. A life Daniel spoke of rarely, and always with quiet, unmistakable pride, though he never burdened anyone with the details of how lonely the empty apartment sometimes felt in the evenings. These days, Daniel filled his hours restoring antique clocks and pocket watches, coaxing old machinery back to life with steady hands and endless patience, a craft that suited a man who had learned, better than most, that some things could not be rushed, only repaired gently, piece by piece, gear by gear. He wore the same soft brown coat most days, drank his coffee black, without apology, and smiled easily, without performance, the way people do when they have nothing left to prove to anyone and nothing left to hide. Shopkeepers along the old commercial block knew him by name and trusted him with heirlooms worth more than they could ever afford to lose. He did not chase attention, and in a city built entirely around chasing it, that alone made him almost invisible. Their first meeting happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind that Emily would later struggle to distinguish from 1,000 others, except for what happened in it. She stepped out of her car outside the building where her company occupied the top 12 floors, her mind already racing 3 meetings ahead, when a gust of wind lifted the silk scarf from around her neck and sent it tumbling across the sidewalk toward the gutter. She barely had time to register the loss before a stranger bent down, caught it just before it slipped beneath a parked car, and held it out to her without ceremony or hesitation. He did not ask for a photograph. He did not slip her a business card the way so many men in her orbit seemed to do, treating every accidental encounter as a networking opportunity disguised as chance. He simply looked at her. Really looked, the way almost no one bothered to anymore in a city obsessed with status and appearances, and said something that startled her more than the wind ever could. "You should smile more," he told her, not unkindly, almost as an observation about the weather. And then he walked away, hands in his coat pockets, leaving Emily standing on the sidewalk, holding her scarf and feeling, for reasons she could not name, unsettled, in a way that had nothing to do with anger. For days afterward, Emily found herself thinking about the stranger's words at unexpected moments, in the middle of board meetings when her attention should have been elsewhere entirely, during the long, silent elevator rides to her office, in the quiet hour before sleep when her mind refused to be still no matter how exhausted the rest of her felt. She told herself it meant nothing, that a passing comment from a man she would likely never see again deserved no more thought than a stray line from a stranger on the street. But something in her had shifted, faintly, like a stone moved an inch from where it had rested, undisturbed for years. She caught herself, once or twice, almost smiling at nothing in particular during an otherwise unremarkable meeting, and then catching herself doing it, surprised at the unfamiliar feeling in her own face. The city, it turned out, was smaller than either of them realized. Daniel spent his days moving between antique shops and old jewelers, scattered through the same downtown blocks, where Emily's company towered over everything else, repairing clocks that had stopped keeping time decades earlier, restoring watches passed down through generations of families who could not bear to let them go silent forever. Their paths crossed again outside a coffee shop near her office one gray Thursday afternoon, then again a week later near a small clock shop she had never noticed before, though she had walked past its narrow door 100 times without ever once looking up. There was no pursuit in it, no calculation on his part. Only the quiet coincidence of 2 people who happened to move through overlapping corners of the same crowded world. Each time, they spoke for only a few minutes. Nothing more. Exchanging small observations about the weather, the particular gold of the season, the specific exhaustion that seemed to hang over every ordinary weekday. One afternoon, Daniel showed her a pocket watch he was restoring for an elderly widow who had carried it for 60 years without ever once opening the back panel to see the mechanism inside. He explained, with the patience of someone who genuinely loved his work rather than simply performing it, that most broken things were not actually broken beyond repair, only neglected, only in need of someone willing to slow down long enough to notice exactly where the trouble had started. Emily listened to him speak about gears and springs, the way other people spoke about poetry, and something in her quietly recognized that he might have been talking about more than watches. She did not say so aloud. She simply sat a little longer than she needed to on the bench outside his shop that day, in no particular hurry to return to the glass tower waiting for her a few blocks away. Slowly, without either of them naming it aloud, those few minutes became something Emily looked forward to more than she cared to admit even to herself. She found herself laughing at things that were not especially funny, simply because Daniel's easy manner made room for laughter, in a way her carefully guarded life almost never did anymore. Her assistant noticed first, remarking once, gently and carefully, that Emily seemed lighter lately, and Emily brushed the comment aside, with a practiced dismissiveness, though she carried it with her longer than she expected to, turning it over in her mind during the drive home. There was no dramatic declaration between them, no rush toward romance the way it happened in the stories she had stopped believing in years earlier. There was only the slow, careful warmth of two wounded people finding, almost by accident, that being near each other made the old wounds ache a little less with each passing week. As autumn deepened, and the trees along the avenue grew barer with every passing storm, Emily's days grew heavier with the particular weight that came with running an empire built on other people's expectations and other people's money. There were board meetings that stretched past midnight, mergers negotiated in rooms thick with tension and cold coffee, shareholders who measured her entire worth only in quarterly numbers printed on glossy reports, journalists who seemed to delight in searching for any crack in her carefully constructed image of invincibility. She carried all of it alone, the way she always had, because trusting anyone with the full weight of her exhaustion had once cost her more than she was willing to risk ever again. And yet, in the middle of the noise, she began to notice a strange and specific relief settling over her whenever she knew she would see Daniel that day. Even briefly, even for the length of a single cup of coffee shared on a wooden bench. He never asked her the questions everyone else seemed to ask within minutes of learning who she was. He never inquired about her net worth, never hinted at wanting an introduction to someone useful, buried within her extensive network, never offered unsolicited advice about how she should be running a company he knew almost nothing about. He asked her, instead, whether she had eaten lunch that day, whether she had slept more than a few hours the night before, whether the particular shade of gray settling over the sky reminded her of anything from her childhood summers. He listened the way few people ever had, without waiting for his turn to speak, without quietly measuring what her words might eventually be worth to him. In his presence, Emily found herself saying things she had never said aloud to anyone in years. Quiet confessions about exhaustion, about a loneliness she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge even in private, about the specific ache of being surrounded by thousands of employees and still going home each night to an apartment that echoed with silence. It did not take long before something in Emily began to wonder, quietly at first, and then more insistently, how a man could possibly be so entirely unbothered by everything that usually defined people who moved through her world. He never seemed to need anything from her at all. He never seemed impressed by her title, never intimidated by her success, never eager to leverage even a single moment of her attention towards some advantage of his own. It should have reassured her completely, and in many ways it did, but it also planted a small, persistent question in the back of her mind that refused to fully quiet itself. People who wanted absolutely nothing were rare enough in her experience to feel suspicious, and Emily had learned, at considerable personal cost, that almost everyone eventually wanted something from her, sooner or later, no matter how patient they first appeared. One evening, sitting alone in her apartment, long after the sun had disappeared behind the neighboring towers, Emily made a decision that surprised even herself. She wanted to know more about the man who had become, without her fully choosing it, one of the few remaining sources of genuine peace left in her life. She told herself it was simple curiosity, the same instinct that made her study every deal thoroughly before ever signing it. But somewhere underneath that tidy explanation lived something softer, something closer to gratitude that wanted a name and a history to attach itself to. She asked a trusted member of her staff, quietly and discreetly, to look gently into the background of a man named Daniel Brooks, fully expecting to find exactly what he appeared to be on the surface, a modest craftsman living a modest, unremarkable life. She almost called the whole inquiry off before it began, feeling faintly ashamed of herself for treating a kind stranger like a potential threat to be vetted and cleared, the way she vetted every vendor and every new hire above a certain salary. But old habits ran deep in Emily, deeper than she liked to admit, and the same caution that had protected her from further heartbreak after her fiancé's betrayal now quietly justified itself as simple due diligence, nothing more than the responsible instincts of a woman who had learned the hard way what happens to people who trust too easily. The report that came back several days later confirmed most of what she had expected to find. Daniel's income was unremarkable by any standard she was accustomed to. His apartment was small and simply furnished. His car older than most vehicles she saw parked outside her own building each morning. His bank accounts entirely ordinary and free of anything resembling hidden wealth. There was no scandal buried anywhere in his history, nothing that suggested a man secretly leading a double life in the way she had half feared he might be. And yet, tucked within the otherwise unremarkable file, were a handful of details that simply did not fit the pattern at all. Small threads that refused to be woven neatly into the picture of an ordinary man. A retired federal judge, when contacted informally through a mutual connection, spoke of Daniel with a warmth and respect usually reserved for old and deeply trusted friends. A university professor mentioned him in passing as someone whose opinion she valued more than almost anyone else's, though she could not quite articulate why when pressed further. A respected physician, asked casually about the name during an unrelated conversation, paused for a long moment before saying only that Daniel Brooks was a good man, the kind the world simply did not make often enough anymore. None of it added up to anything Emily could clearly define or explain away, and that, more than any hidden fortune could ever have, unsettled her far more deeply than she was willing to admit. The unease did not have long to settle before Emily's entire world was pulled apart by something far larger than her private curiosity about one quiet man, an aggressive investment fund, one that had circled her company for months with quiet, calculated patience, launched a hostile bid to take control, moving with a speed and coordination that suggested they had been planning the attack long before Emily ever caught the first faint signal of it. Stock prices fell sharply within a matter of days, wiping away months of careful growth in a matter of hours. Board members who had once stood firmly behind her began making private calls late into the night, quietly weighing loyalty against their own self-interest as the pressure mounted from every direction. The financial press, always hungry for a story of a powerful woman finally losing her grip, ran headline after headline questioning whether the Ice Queen had at last met the crisis she could not survive. Emily felt the ground shifting beneath everything she had built with her own two hands over more than a decade of relentless work. Sleep abandoned her almost entirely during those days. She sat through emergency meetings where lawyers spoke in low, urgent tones about exit strategies and severance packages, as though her eventual departure were already a foregone conclusion rather than a fight she still believed was worth having. For the first time in many years, Emily felt something close to real despair, the particular kind that comes not from failure itself, but from the terrifying possibility that everything she had sacrificed her personal life for might simply be taken from her by people who had never built anything of lasting value. The man leading the hostile bid was a former colleague named Robert Hale, a sharp-tongued investor who had once tried and failed to acquire a seat on her board years earlier, and had never quite forgiven her for the public manner in which she declined him. He gave interviews, suggesting that Emily's leadership had grown emotionally distant and strategically stale, that the company needed fresh eyes, unclouded by personal pride, and every word of it was calculated to plant doubt in exactly the places where doubt could do the most damage. Emily read each article in silence, refusing to respond publicly, though privately the accusations cut deeper than she let anyone see, because some small part of her feared they might contain a grain of truth she had never allowed herself to examine. In the middle of that storm, she found herself, almost without consciously deciding to, standing outside the small clock shop where she so often found Daniel bent over some delicate mechanism, his hand steady even when the rest of the world seemed to be shaking apart around her. She told him everything that had happened, the takeover attempt, the falling stock, the board members already quietly distancing themselves from her, the exhaustion that had settled so deep into her bones, she wondered if she would ever feel truly rested again in her life. She expected sympathy, perhaps gentle words, meant only to comfort rather than actually help, the kind of well-meaning uselessness she had grown accustomed to from people who cared about her personally but understood absolutely nothing about the world she operated in. Instead, Daniel listened without interrupting even once. His expression calm, in a way that seemed almost impossible given the genuine panic in her voice. And when she finally finished speaking, he said only one thing to her. "Do not sign anything before tomorrow morning," he told her. Quietly but with a certainty that left no room whatsoever for negotiation or doubt. There was no explanation offered, no further detail volunteered, only the simple instruction and the steady, unwavering look in his eyes that somehow made Emily believe him more completely than she believed the expensive lawyers who had spent the entire day filling her ears with urgency and thinly disguised fear. Against every instinct her professional training had ever carefully taught her, Emily agreed to wait. She went home that night not with false confidence, but with something rarer and far more valuable. A fragile and unfamiliar trust that had nothing whatsoever to do with contracts or leverage, and everything to do with the quiet certainty in one man's voice. The next morning arrived heavier with tension than any morning in Emily's entire professional life up to that point. She walked into the boardroom expecting to face the final negotiations of a defeat she had spent the entire sleepless night trying to mentally prepare herself for, only to find the room already filled with unfamiliar faces, a team of lawyers she recognized instantly by reputation alone, among the most formidable and expensive legal minds the entire city had to offer. They carried thick folders of documentation under their arms, moving with the calm efficiency of people who already knew the outcome of a battle others in the room were still fighting blindly. The board members who had been so eager to abandon her only the day before sat in stunned silence, glancing nervously between the new arrivals and each other, clearly as confused by the sudden turn of events as Emily herself was. Piece by piece, the documents laid out on the long table revealed something Emily had never once known existed within her own company's long history. Hidden among decades of ownership records was a silent shareholder, someone who had quietly retained a stake large enough, if exercised at precisely the right moment, to block any hostile takeover, outright and completely. The name attached to that stake had been sealed under confidentiality agreements so airtight that even Emily's own legal team had never managed to uncover it during years of routine annual audits. Whispers moved through the room like static electricity crackling along a wire. Board members leaning toward each other and murmuring frantic theories, none of them landing anywhere close to the truth that was about to be spoken aloud into that stunned silence. One of the senior attorneys rose slowly to his feet, opened a final sealed folder, and read a single name into the frozen silence of the room. The silent shareholder, the one whose long dormant stake had just single-handedly halted a hostile takeover that threatened to destroy everything Emily had spent her entire adult life building, was Daniel Brooks. For a long, suspended moment, Emily could not process the words at all, her mind flatly refusing to connect the quiet, unassuming clockmaker she had come to trust with the enormous, quiet financial power the documents so plainly described. The room around her seemed to tilt slightly on its axis, voices blurring into a low, distant hum as every certainty she had ever built about her own life quietly rearranged itself in real time. It emerged slowly and carefully, through the documents and through the careful testimony of lawyers who had clearly known far more than they had ever revealed until that very moment, that Daniel had been one of the original engineers who built the entire technical foundation of the very company Emily now led with such pride. Years earlier, in the company's most fragile and uncertain infancy, when it teetered on the edge of total collapse and almost no one believed it would survive its first difficult year, it had been Daniel's work, his code written alone in the middle of the night, his relentless, unpaid hours, that had kept the fledgling company alive long enough to finally find its footing in a crowded market. He had never once sought recognition for any of it. He had never appeared in a single interview, never claimed public credit in any record, never allowed his name to be publicly attached to the success that eventually followed years after he had already walked away from it entirely. Robert Hale, watching his carefully constructed plan collapse in real time from the back of the same boardroom, rose halfway from his chair as though to object, then sat back down without a word, when he understood there was nothing left to argue. His allies at the table suddenly found reasons to avoid his eyes entirely, and within the hour, the fund he represented issued a brief statement, withdrawing its offer altogether, citing unspecified changes in market conditions that fooled absolutely no one who had been present in that room. Emily did not gloat. She barely noticed him leave. Her entire attention remained fixed on the name still hanging in the air, a name she had spoken dozens of times over the past several weeks, without ever once imagining it belonged to the man who had just saved everything. Emily spent the following days retracing the entire history of her own company, as though reading it for the very first time. And in many important ways, she truly was. Every document she uncovered confirmed the same astonishing truth from a slightly different angle each time. Daniel had personally written the earliest architecture that still, in heavily modified form, ran quietly beneath the surface of nearly everything the company did today. Powering systems no one thought to question because they simply worked. He had personally intervened, using resources few people ever knew he possessed at the time, to keep the company from complete bankruptcy during its most desperate and uncertain year. And then, at the very height of his growing influence within the company, when he could have easily claimed a place among the most celebrated names in the entire industry, he had instead walked away from all of it silently and without protest, to care full-time for a wife who had just been diagnosed with an illness that offered no cure and very little remaining time together. The records showed, in careful and quiet detail, that Daniel had spent every remaining year of his wife's life faithfully by her side, present for every difficult morning and every long, aching night, choosing her over an empire that would have made him rich and famous many times over. Choosing love over legacy, in a way the world so rarely gets the privilege of witnessing, because it happens so infrequently. After she passed away, he never once returned to the fast-moving business world he had helped build from absolutely nothing years earlier. He raised his son alone afterward, quietly and without complaint, in a small apartment above a bakery, eventually turning to restoring old clocks, because there was something honest and unhurried in gently bringing broken things back to life, one careful gear at a time. This, Emily finally understood, with a clarity that left her breathless, was the secret far larger than any hidden fortune could ever possibly have been. It was not that Daniel was secretly wealthy. It was that he had once possessed everything the world constantly tells people to want above all else, and had given every bit of it up, without a single moment of regret, for the sake of someone he loved more than his own ambition. Among the old files, Emily found a single photograph she had not expected, Daniel standing in front of a much smaller version of the very building she now worked in every day, younger, thinner, his sleeves rolled up, and a look of exhausted triumph on his face after what had clearly been an impossibly long night of work. Beside him in the photograph stood a woman with a gentle smile, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, and Emily understood without needing to be told that this was his wife. Present at the birth of a company she would not live long enough to see grow into what it eventually became. Emily sat with that photograph for a long time, feeling something shift permanently inside her chest. A tenderness she had not expected to feel for a woman she had never met, and a man she thought she already knew. When Emily finally saw Daniel again, later that same evening, she could not stop the tears that came without warning, standing quietly in the doorway of his small apartment, surrounded by dozens of old clocks ticking softly, in overlapping, unsynchronized rhythms. For the first time in her entire adult life, she understood, not merely as an abstract idea but as a deeply felt truth, that someone could look at another person and see them entirely apart from what they possessed or what they could ever offer in return. Daniel had never once approached her because of her company, her considerable wealth, or her public influence. From the very beginning, on that windy sidewalk months earlier, he had seen only a woman standing alone, holding herself together through sheer force of will, and something quiet in him had simply wanted her to remember how to smile again. Through her tears, Emily finally asked the question that had been quietly building inside her since the very moment the truth was first spoken aloud in that stunned boardroom. "Why did you never tell me?" she asked him softly, her voice smaller and more uncertain than she had intended it to sound. Daniel considered the question for a long, thoughtful moment before answering with a gentleness that seemed to hold no trace of regret or hidden resentment. "If you had known from the very beginning," he told her quietly, "you would have looked at me the way a chief executive looks at a shareholder, and never once with your heart open the way it finally is now." It was, without either of them ever naming it aloud, the true emotional center of everything that had happened between them, the quiet truth that some of the most important things a person can offer must be given freely, without any expectation of ever being recognized or repaid for them. They sat together that night, among the quietly ticking clocks until well past midnight. Neither of them in any hurry to fill the silence with more words than were necessary. Daniel spoke, haltingly at first, and then with growing ease, about the year his wife had been sick, about learning to be gentle in ways he never knew he had inside him, about the strange peace that eventually settles over a person once they stop fighting the truth of what is coming, and simply choose to be present for whatever time remains. Emily found herself telling him things in return she had never told another living soul. About the wedding that never happened. About the friend who had betrayed her. About the particular loneliness of being surrounded by admiration and starved of anything resembling real intimacy. Neither of them tried to fix the other that night. They simply listened, the way they always had from the very beginning. And somewhere, in that long, unhurried conversation, both of them understood that whatever this was between them had already become something neither one intended to walk away from. In the weeks that followed, Emily made her decision without any further hesitation, formally rejecting the hostile takeover attempt entirely and steering her company carefully back toward the stability it had so nearly lost forever. Daniel, for his part, transferred his long-dormant voting shares directly into Emily's sole control, firmly refusing any position of power or influence within the company he had once quietly helped bring into existence from nothing. "This has always been your company," he told her simply one evening, standing in the quiet of his small apartment, surrounded by the steady, comforting ticking of 100 carefully restored clocks. Emily shook her head gently, correcting him with a certainty she had never once expected to feel about anything again after everything that had happened to her. "No," she said softly. "This is the dream that you built with your own hands, and I have simply had the privilege of carrying it forward in your place." Word of what had happened spread quickly through the company in the days that followed. Not through any official announcement, but through the quiet, reverent way stories move between people who have witnessed something they know they will remember for the rest of their careers. Employees who had once whispered about the Ice Queen behind closed doors now spoke of her differently, not with less respect but with something warmer added to it, a recognition that the woman who had guided them through crisis after crisis was also capable of being profoundly, humanly moved. Daniel, for his part, avoided the attention entirely, slipping quietly back into his clock shop within days, uninterested in interviews or recognition, even as journalists began circling the story of the silent shareholder who had once built an empire and walked away from it twice. A full year passed quietly by, and the city moved once again through another autumn, the leaves once more turning that same deep, unhurried gold that had first brought Emily and Daniel together on an ordinary windy morning. Emily and Daniel had by then built something quieter and steadier together than either of them had ever known to hope for, founding jointly a scholarship fund and a mentorship program specifically for young entrepreneurs who reminded them, each in their own different way, of who they had once been long before the world had tried so hard to harden them. Their shared philosophy remained simple and unwavering throughout every decision they made together. That people should always come before profit, and that success meant absolutely nothing if it was built entirely on the isolation of the very person achieving it. At the company's next anniversary celebration, Emily stood before thousands of gathered employees who had once known her only as a distant, unreachable figure standing behind glass walls. And she smiled at them, fully and without any restraint whatsoever. The very same smile so many people had quietly assumed was gone from her forever. Guests at the celebration that afternoon included several of the very people whose brief, cryptic comments had once deepened Emily's confusion during her initial inquiry into Daniel's background: the retired judge, the university professor, and the physician who had once called him simply a good man without further explanation. Each of them approached Emily privately over the course of the afternoon, and each of them, in their own way, admitted that they had known some piece of the truth for years and had kept it quietly out of respect for Daniel's own wishes. The judge told her that Daniel had once helped him through the darkest period of his own life without ever mentioning it again afterward. The physician confessed that Daniel had quietly covered the cost of a young patient's treatment years earlier and sworn her to secrecy about it. Hearing these stories one after another, Emily began to understand that the version of Daniel revealed in the boardroom was only the smallest visible fraction of a much larger, much quieter pattern of generosity he had been practicing for years without ever once seeking acknowledgement. She thanked Daniel publicly that day, standing before the entire company with her voice steady and clear, though not for saving her company from collapse, and not for the shares he had quietly protected on her behalf for years, without ever once asking for anything in return. She thanked him, instead, for teaching her how to trust again after everything she had lost, for showing her that a life measured only in numbers and quarterly achievements had always been missing something essential and irreplaceable, something no balance sheet could ever hope to hold or measure. As the ceremony ended, and the crowd slowly dispersed into the golden afternoon light spilling across the plaza, Emily and Daniel walked out of the building together, hand in hand, past the very same stretch of sidewalk where a silk scarf had once been caught by the wind and gently returned by a stranger who had asked for absolutely nothing at all in return. That evening, after the guests had gone, and the plaza had emptied of everyone but the two of them, Emily and Daniel stopped walking for a moment beneath the same tree where she had once nearly lost her scarf to a passing gust of wind. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out that very scarf, worn soft now from a year of quiet use, and told him she had never once stopped carrying it since the morning he handed it back to her. Daniel smiled at that, the same easy, unguarded smile that had first caught her attention on a sidewalk full of strangers, and admitted that he still kept the pocket watch he had been restoring the day they truly began to know each other, unsold and unfinished, because some part of him had never wanted the excuse to see her again to run out. They stood together in the cooling evening air a while longer, saying very little, needing very little more than the simple fact of each other's presence after everything the past year had asked of them both. The city moved on around them exactly as it always did, indifferent and entirely unaware of the quiet miracle that had unfolded within it. But for the two people walking slowly through the softly falling leaves, something had shifted permanently and unmistakably for the better. A man who had once given up an entire empire for the sake of love had found, quite unexpectedly, a second chance to build something meaningful again, without ever losing the deep humility that had always defined him at his core. A woman who had built walls so high around her heart that she had nearly forgotten what warmth even felt like, had finally allowed those same walls to come down, not all at once in a single dramatic moment, but gently and gradually, the way old locks eventually give way when exactly the right hand finally turns the key with patience. Behind them, the tower of glass and steel that had silently witnessed both of their separate histories stood catching the very last light of the afternoon sun, and ahead of them stretched a road neither of them could fully see the end of just yet, though for the first time, in a very long while, both of them walked forward entirely unafraid of wherever it might eventually lead.